In the late 1970s, the United States was in the midst of a sharp economic decline, following many years of unprecedented growth after World War II. President Jimmy Carter swallowed his pride and candidly broke the bad news to the American people in his now infamous 1979 televised speech, where he warned people about the consequences of excess consumerism in contemporary society. People did not take it well, and immediately panicked at the prospect of the American dream no longer being a viable aspiration for your average person. But qualities like honesty and integrity are essential and of the utmost importance to American voters, right? I mean, surely somebody wouldn't come along with a campaign of lies built on a false narrative of unwavering patriotism and economic prosperity for everybody forever and ever, right? Right? Ronald Reagan, 40th U.S. President, mildly successful actor turned politician, divorced and remarried principled conservative Christian, and devoted man of the people. Wealthy people, that is. A masterful orator, Ron managed to convey a comforting and convincing message of economic prosperity to an impressive number of average Americans, while conveying a coded message of white superiority for the many white middle-class people who were afraid of the scary poor minorities who were allegedly encroaching on their communities, making the promise that a vote for him was a vote against the people who don't deserve your tax dollars. Reagan's presidency marked a hard turn to the farther right-wing elements of American conservatism, ushering in a new era of social and economic policy changes, carrying lasting ramifications that are still felt across the globe today. Though in all fairness to his predecessor, it was Jimmy Carter's administration that started these economic reforms. But it was the Reagan camp that picked up the ball and ran with it. They ran. They ran so far away, and in fact, they ran all night and day. Under the pretense of economic decline, Americans needed reassurance, hope, and change. No, not that hope and change. America needed a new way of doing things. A restructuring of the economy. The Reagan administration got to work, turning to neoliberal-style reforms to get the wheels of the economic machine rolling once again, giving this specific brand of policy changes the totally not self-serving title of Reaganomics. Neoliberalism is a capitalist, right-wing economic ideology, which asserts that the only way to achieve economic growth is to cut regulations on businesses, significantly lower taxes for some, and slash public spending towards infrastructure and welfare in favor of large subsidies to private businesses. This way, the poor businesses aren't hampered by their obligations to not pollute the areas that they operate in, or ensure safe housing standards, because asbestos is pretty great, actually. In this way, taxes, that pool of funds that we all chip into to ensure that we fund and maintain schools, roads, libraries, public transport, healthcare, for some, and countless other public services. Yes, by cutting those taxes, you now no longer have to be burdened with the proportional cost of maintaining our societal infrastructure, but now you have a negligible amount of extra money to spend on you, the individual. Tax decreases, of course, disproportionately favored the wealthy. But that's okay, said Reagan. The economic benefits of the rich will trickle down to everyone else, based on very real evidence that we just haven't seen yet. What revenue the government continued to generate in taxes was mostly redirected to the private sector, offering giant subsidies for the oil and gas industries, private housing developers, and private prisons, while mass amounts of government land and industries were contracted out or fully sold off to private interests, both domestic and abroad. The result of all this was an emboldened private sector, fast becoming more influential than the combined wealth and power of the American people. To us regular folk, this sounds pretty bad, because usually we like public services and being able to live in environments where we won't breathe in toxic fumes every time we step onto our back porch. But to many elites and established governments, this sounded pretty darn swell. In the UK, Prime Minister and swamp monster Margaret Thatcher began instituting similar policies and reforms around the same time, privatizing and deregulating many industries. Soon after, Roger Douglas, the finance minister of New Zealand at the time, followed closely behind the US and the UK with his economic policy proposals, resulting in, you guessed it, privatization of public services and deregulation of many industries. His brand of political prescriptions were given the very clever and original name Rogernomics. Shortly thereafter, Australia and many other European, Asian, and South American countries started to reorganize their economies in similar ways. This is also the point where most Western manufacturing was outsourced to China and other less developed Asian countries. Many politicians like to point at the very evil and mean Chinese for stealing all of our jobs and ruining everything, but what they fail to admit is the fact that we willingly sold off our means of production to China. because it meant we could import goods for cheaper than what it cost to manufacture them domestically, paving the way for the miracle of shelves stacked with mass-produced cheap plastic birthday party decorations in exchange for the mere jobs and livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of individuals and communities whose economic well-being was inextricably connected to manufacturing jobs all throughout the Western world. Now, after 40 years of having their lives and communities steadily deteriorating, people are a little bit upset. Though every country has a unique economy and implemented these policies differently, they more or less had similar results. Social and economic growth for large business owners, but diminished quality of public services, widespread layoffs, and decreased access to welfare support for everyone else. Private businesses now had fewer safety regulations to follow when operating, with more opportunities for government subsidies, while people who were already struggling became further disempowered. The global economy has continued on this trajectory for the last 40 years, slowly shifting power into the hands of wealthy weenies, one policy proposal at a time. These developments are often sold as means to increasing competition between industries, granting we humble consumers more choices for consumption. You know that single terrible cell phone company in your area? How about 3 terrible cell phone companies in your area? Hey, you know that government-owned utility company that is exclusively incentivized to give you quality services? Now what if those utilities were operated by private corporations, incentivized exclusively by profit? That's good for us non-owners of multinational utility companies because reasons. Sometimes people take notice of what is happening, but for the most part, modern governments are very effective at masking their intentions and convincing people that neoliberal economic developments are actually good for them. However, sometimes it becomes very obvious what is going on. In the US after the 2008 financial crisis, the Hope and Change guy hoped that giving a portion of tax dollars with at least 9 zeros at the end of it to bail out the corporations that caused it would lead them to change their minds about how they conducted business. They did not. A relatively small number of people recognized this for what it was. Government pretending to stimulate the economy after a disaster, while in reality, further transferring wealth from the bottom to the top. It didn't take long for the people who were outraged by the bailout to be validated, thanks to our good friend COVID-19. When the virus had become a very obvious economic threat, Congress acted quickly and passed the CARES Act, a $2.2 trillion stimulus package to help ease the economic damage done by the pandemic. Regular folks got a sweet one-off $1,200 check in envelopes each personally licked by Donald Trump, along with temporary increases to unemployment benefits and a handful of other things that were not enough to combat the magnitude of the crisis at hand for average people. Corporations, however, were pretty happy with the more than $500 billion they received as part of the bill, even though they were the ones that absolutely had the funds to weather the storm. And even if they didn't, hey, that's the free market, baby. Fitting well within the theme of poor and working class people being disenfranchised, the CARES Act was the largest transfer of wealth from citizenry to the private sector in history. America is just one example, and is hardly unique in its prioritization of economic interests over the well-being of its citizenry. Following the pandemic, rampant wealth inequality is becoming clear to many of us, whether or not we're aware of the influence that neoliberal policies had on the shift to global power. We can all see the constantly growing influence of corporations and our shrinking quality of life and public services. We can all see the prices of goods and services going up, while our wages stagnate and jobs become increasingly unfulfilling. We can all see the growing number of homeless people in our towns and cities, due to the ever-increasing cost of housing that brings many of us closer and closer to joining their encampments every time our rent is increased yet again. Many of us see it and want to fix it, but we don't know how, or if it's even possible. If you're a millennial like me, or one of them Zoomers, or even some Generation X folks, many of the economic decisions that have had the most profound impact on our lives were made before we were even born. The power we once had as a group has been systematically siphoned away from us for decades, then placed neatly in the palm of elite hands and used against us to make sure we stay in line. And don't start expecting ridiculous things like a return on the taxes we invest in society or drinkable water. There was a time when us regular old folks had political power in the form of trade unions, which are voluntary organizations which promote and protect the interests of workers for either a particular workplace or a whole industry. Unions will negotiate on behalf of their members for benefits exclusive to those who join, including better pay, more manageable hours, and access to legal services if you need to settle a workplace dispute. In more extreme cases of employee rights abuses, it is unions that organize and manage workplace strikes and protests to combat it. Unions generally take a small percentage of worker paychecks to fund the services they provide. This is, of course, a huge benefit to a worker starting a new job, but neoliberal policymakers were more worried about the benefits of business owners. You know, the little guys. Unions are the barrier between workers and their exploitation, so naturally, stripping power away from unions was a core component of the neoliberal economic agenda. To some extent, most of these governments greatly hindered the ability of unions to protect their workers. It began with anti-union rhetoric, when government leaders started asserting that workers were paying too much in union fees. But on top of that, unions are either ineffective, corrupt, or both, which in some cases was true. But if these politicians truly had workers' best interests at heart, they would have reformed corrupt unions and better funded the ones that underperformed. Instead, they changed laws to take away many unions' rights to organize strikes, and they cut their funding. In many other cases, so many union jobs were outsourced overseas that even some larger unions no longer had any power. Oh, and in many cases had the state brutally crack down on union protesters. Unions only make a difference when they have the funding and the numbers to put up a meaningful opposition to employers. Today, unions typically do not have what they need to fight back against large businesses, on account of most corporations being supported by governments and having infinite money. Some unions are doing what little they can for their workers, but many others have become highly politicized entities, aligning with specific political parties rather than the workers, resulting in weak unions that have no desire to step out of line for fear of losing funding and favor from their political masters. Needless to say, if unions are bending to the will of a political party or institution, they're probably not following the will of the people, which is less than ideal for people who like to earn a living and have rights at the same time. The unfortunate reality for many of us today is a political landscape in which we have very little money and power relative to those who have benefited most from the neoliberal era, kicked off by a proportionately small number of people who tried to fix the world economy by sucking away the resources of average people and giving them to corporations. Corporations driven not by a desire to fill a need or deliver innovative goods and services, but by profit. The perpetual pursuit of pithy profits predictably results in businesses that place the needs of monetary growth and expansion well above the needs of their workers, which governments not only allow them to do, but encourage and incentivize them to do. With unions out of the way, millions of workers are stuck in mundane, dead-end jobs with comically wealthy owners who meticulously manage the number of crumbs thrown to their laborers. You know, the people whose labor generates profit. Well, the laborers are sick of this cycle, with people working in these jobs becoming increasingly aware of the fact that they're seen only as tools to generate money for capitalists. Neoliberalism is super last century, but where we go from here is anyone's guess. The ruling class desperately want business as usual to continue forever and ever, because they reckon money and power are pretty sweet. Unfortunately for them, people want it back. At least some of it. Any of it. Some suggest we get rid of the government and let businesses run everything, like in WALL-E. Some suggest we blame immigrants for everything and banish them, which will lead to economic growth and prosperity, like Brexit. Some suggest we abandon our technological advancements, cast off our cumbersome clothing, and return to a primal society of hunter-gatherers, which I am principally very on board with, but can't seem to solve the current logistical hurdle that is the impending destruction of all of the ecosystems. Some like me suggest that we reimagine our economy in a way that incentivizes businesses to produce goods and services that society actually needs. Businesses that are structured in a way that uplifts their workers and makes them a part of the decision-making process of the companies for which they create value, backed by unions that protect their rights and constantly fight for better conditions. I think this sounds pretty swell, and if you do too, why don't you go ahead and press the corresponding buttons below my face which indicate that is the case. That way you can help spread the message to other people who might think this is pretty swell too.